Welcome to a video on a specific body defense, our external defenses. And we're looking at a picture of just that, which is the skin. And our skin provides a lot of different functions besides just the obvious as being a physical barrier. So we're going to look pretty closely at the different roles of defense that the integument that the skin uses and go through each one of those. And we'll go through each one of those we'll start with the macroscopic and we'll show you how those overall goals, those functions on a macroscopic level actually can be traced back to some microscopic structures, specifically the cells within our skin. So let's begin by taking a look at those macroscopic structures. So we have the skin, hair, and nails. Those are the major organs that make up our integumentary system. And yes, the hair and nails do provide some functions that are important to defense, but this video specifically is going to just solely look at the skin. So let's look at the skin and how it's organized. You can see here that we've got 3 layers within the skin, and each of those layers provides several different functions. And so we're going to look at those from the outermost to innermost. We'll start with the epidermis, the thinnest layer of the skin, and then head down deeper into the dermis, and finally the last one, the hypodermis. Hypo meaning below or lower. So if we think of the skin collectively as an organ, which it is, the skin is made then up of 3 tissues. We'll start with the epidermis, and the epidermis then itself is made of cells. So let's dig into the epidermis. So one of the functions overall of the skin, as I mentioned, is to provide protection. And that specifically is going to happen in that outermost layer of the skin, the epidermis. And one type of protection that the epidermis provides is waterproofing, water repelling, if you will, from the outside. And so to do that, we have to introduce then the first of our cells, the keratinocytes. So let me orient you to where we're looking at in this picture and then show you how they can provide that function of waterproofing. So our top layer of skin cells here is the darker purple pinkish, the epidermis. You can see it has those little dips into the dermis there. If we go and zoom in on kind of the dividing line between the epidermis and dermis, that's where you'll find the kind of the newest keratinocytes in our skin. And when they're down there, they're doing a lot of different functions. One of which is making vitamin D for us. But the other thing that those keratinocytes are doing is they're producing a protein in their ribosomes called keratin. I'm sure you've heard before, it's found a lot in your hair, but the keratin we're going to focus on here is part of your epidermis, has a waterproofing feature. So those cells that are down at the very base of your epidermis, they'll be cranking out the keratin, and they'll slowly be pushed up to the top of the epidermis, and by newer keratinocytes, as those divide and they push up the older ones up. As time goes on, those keratinocytes fill up with keratin. In fact, they become dead. By the time they get to these stratified upper layers of the epidermis, those keratinocytes are dead skin cells. But they're also serving a purpose. They're filled with keratin, which is a waterproofing protein. And that whole process takes about 28 days, takes about a month for those new keratinocytes to make their way to the top as they do. And you're always replacing those dead skin cells. Those are dead keratinocytes, but they did or do serve a purpose of waterproofing. Also within the epidermis, there's another type of protection, UV protection. Here's how that works. So we have, in kind of the same location as those beginning keratinocytes, you can see at the base of the epidermis, we have the other type of cell that I want to highlight in the epidermis. They're called melanocytes. And the job of melanocytes is to provide UV protection. Now, how do they actually do that? let's zoom in on this drawing down below, and I probably cut that off a little bit. However, you can kind of see part of it here. You can see here, these are appendages of melanocytes. They almost kind of look like tentacles. And the job of the melanocyte is to produce a protein. This time, the protein that they produce, you can see little spots of it here, is known as melanin. Melanin is a pigment. The more melanin in your skin cells, the darker your skin. But there is a purpose. That melanin, that pigment, is spread by the tentacles of the melanocytes all over surrounding cells in your skin, all around those keratinocytes. And what that melanin does once it's released by those tentacles is it almost acts as like a little shield, a little umbrella. And so when we say it protects against UV, it's actually protecting the DNA of all of our skin cells. Again, like an umbrella would, to shield the DNA from any potential UV radiation, which would go on to cause mutations in that DNA. So that's why those melanocytes have those funky appendages to spread as much melanin to every cell as possible. So we're going to move on from the epidermis and move deeper. So I'm going to highlight some cells, some structures within the dermis that combine to provide certain functions for the overall skin. And those structures are blood vessels and sweat glands. So the overall function here is temperature regulation. So blood vessels, we'll look at those first. Their job is to either vasodilate or vasoconstrict, get larger or get smaller. What you need to really make sure is that you can tell me how that helps regulate body temperature. And so we can see in this picture the vasodilation happening here. Our blood vessels are getting bigger. That increases blood flow near the surface of the skin. More blood flow, more heat can be lost. So vasodilation cools you down. On the other hand, the opposite happens for vasoconstriction. And I always like to put the word constriction with conserve. The blood vessels get smaller, less blood flow is going to the surface of our skin, and so then you can conserve heat to keep you warmer. And those blood vessels are found in the dermis. There's no blood vessels, in fact, found in the epidermis. It's too thin. The other structure within the dermis that provides temperature regulation are our sweat glands. And our sweat glands release sweat, which is primarily water. And up to the surface, once water reaches the surface, it can evaporate into a vapor, and that action actually cools us down. The other function of the dermis is sensation, your sense of touch. Now, if you look at this picture, you'll notice that there's lots of different kinds of receptors. But I'm going to highlight the key categories that are important to note. So the first one on the left of your screen are nociceptors. These are receptors that detect pain. Then I'm going to jump over here to the other side of your screen, the thermoreceptors, and that should make some sense that they detect temperature, hot or cold sensations within the dermis. And then the last category, I'm going to lump all of them together. So I'm going to generally categorize them as mechanoreceptors. The specific types of mechanoreceptors are not important, but I think what's interesting to note is that there's lots of different types of receptors for touch. So there's different corpuscles that sense deep pressure versus very light touch versus vibrations versus stretch. And even in our hairs, we can sense changes in position there as well. So there's mechanoreceptors that are very specialized in lots of different types of sensation. And so that's the dermis. So we are heading now to the last layer of skin, the innermost layer. We have specific cells within the hypodermis that contribute overall to the function of the integument. And those cells, if you take a look overall at this slide, are called adipocytes. Adipocytes are adipose, and another way to say that are fat cells. So the structure is primarily just a really thick cushioning layer of fat, is the hypodermis. And so fat cells have two functions. Actually, you could classify that as three. They are good insulators, they provide cushion for underlying structures, and they also are an energy reserve when your body needs to rely on fat rather than carbohydrates. So that's the only part of the hypodermis. And so as we wrap up here, I really want to emphasize how important it is to link the big picture. What are the jobs of the skin, the macroscopic structure? What are those jobs? How can you relate it back to the microscopic structures within the skin? So let me show you how that works. So we have the overall function of protection. And one of the structures that was mentioned in this video are melanocytes. So how do melanocytes, despite being microscopic, how do they provide protection? And so you want to link structure, function. So by doing this, oops, wrong way. Here's my answer. Melanocytes provide protection, and I could say they simply just provide UV protection. But that doesn't say how. It doesn't link clearly structure to function. Here's how. Melanocytes produce melanin, which is a pigment, and I go one step further. That pigment then protects DNA in nearby cells from UV radiation. That's how you link microscopic structures on one scale to big picture functions on another scale. So thank you for listening, and I hope that this was helpful.